Rest in peace. Completion of life. This dead body was no longer breathing, no longer functioning. It was a normal night at the funeral home. The small town only boasted one funeral home. It was usually an older person who had lived out their life, such as the lady on the table. At 92, she had a full life with a loving family. There would be a sizable crowd at the viewing. The mortician, Paul, was putting the final touches on Mrs. Craven's makeup. The embalming process was all complete. In the morning, she would be moved to her coffin. It was not unusual for Paul to work this late. He was always rushing to help the living during the day, that the nighttime was the best time to tend to the dead. He did so with loving care. He was a great mortician. When Paul was certain that Mrs. Craven was beyond perfection, he turned off the light in the depressing room of death and headed upstairs to the main floor of the funeral home. He lived on the top floor, and his bones ached as he ascended the next flight of stairs to his living quarters. He brushed his hand across his sweaty, balding head. He must be coming down with something. He ran through a shower and then climbed in bed half naked. He felt feverish. Dreams swirled through his head, dark spirals of madness in vivid colors. He saw blood-red splatters on every surface. Visions of dead people he had laid to rest stood over him and laughed. "Your time is up," they whispered. Mrs. Craven came into view in her astute, haughty manner. "Oh, wake up, you fool!" she screamed. Paul jolted up in bed as he heard the bell for the front door of the funeral home echo throughout eerily. What time was it? 3 a.m. No one had ever just rang the bell this late at night. If he needed to pick up a body, he would get a phone call. He quickly got up and threw some jeans on. He hurried downstairs to approach the door, extremely apprehensive. Paul reached for the lock and slowly turned it. He turned the knob and pulled the door open with one big yank. A body laid on his doorstep. A young woman, he assumed her to be in her late 20s. She was in a horrible state, bruises and scratches all over her body. The decaying was already starting to take place as her face was black and falling in on the right side. Her long, dark hair was tangled and matted. She had a deep gash on her upper thigh, like she had been mauled by some creature. There was a note laying on her chest. Paul picked it up before touching the body. "Sorry to dump a body and run. Please bury this witch. She was running through the woods on my property, speaking in tongues. I think she put a curse on my land. My dog got her on the leg. Then she just fell to the ground. I'm not saying my dog killed her, but I think this is a demon witch with specific powers, and I don't want to be responsible for not giving her a proper burial. And please don't call the police. No one is going to miss her." "What in the hell?" Paul muttered. His staff only worked daytime hours, so Paul would have to drag this lady downstairs. Rigor mortis had already set in, and the body was very stiff. He bent over to place his arms under the young lady's and pull her through into the house. He dragged her through the parlor. He quickly noticed he was dragging a trail of blood as he pulled her through. He set her down on the floor and went to fetch the gurney from his van outside. The breeze was chilling. He felt as if he were standing on his head as he opened the back door to the van. "It's time, Paul," he heard plainly in his ear. Paul gasped and lurched back to see who was behind him. There stood Mrs. Devers, the lady he had just buried 2 days ago. "Mrs. Devers?" he shuddered in fear. "Leave the witch alone and come with me." Mrs. Devers held out a wrinkled hand to him. Paul turned back to the van, pulled the gurney out, and slammed the door shut. He spun around, and Mrs. Devers was gone. "I am seeing things tonight. Must be the fever," he breathed to himself. He was still a little warm. He walked through where Mrs. Devers had been and headed back into the house with the gurney. He got back to the parlor, and the girl was gone. There was a trail of blood left behind, as if someone else was dragging her through the house. Paul swallowed hard and took a breath. Maybe one of his employees came to help and went ahead and took the body down for him. Sure enough, the trail led to the door that led to the embalming room, and the door was open. Of course, that's what happened. "It's time, Paul," he heard a male voice behind him. Paul turned to see Mr. Horace. Mr. Horace was laid to rest Sunday. "If you embalm her, you will be cursed for eternity," Mr. Horace warned. "You are not real. You are dead. You are the result of a fever," Paul screamed at the spectral vision. Mr. Horace just shook his head in a sad manner and disappeared. Paul spun around and darted down the steps. He turned on the light, and there she was, laying on the table, already prepped for embalming. "Frank, are you down here?" Paul looked around, searching for his faithful employee. There was no response, but since the process had already begun, he felt the strong urge to finish. Blood was draining from the girl rapidly. Paul put on a pair of gloves, a protective mask, and a gown, and began to massage different parts of the girl's hand to ensure the blood vessels were opening and emptying properly. Paul looked up and noticed Mrs. Craven sitting up on the table across from the girl. "Poor Paul. The undertaker is about to be undertaken. It's time, and you didn't listen." Paul lurched back, but something had hold of his hand. Paul looked down, and the girl's eyes were wide open. Her hand latched onto his wrist. "Never embalm a witch, dearie," she screeched. They found him in bed. His hands clutched to his heart. The coroner ruled it a heart attack he had while he was sleeping, but now he was cursed to relive the same night over and over for all eternity. Paul jolted up in bed as he heard the bell for the front door of the funeral home echo throughout eerily. What time was it?